Hello and welcome to the Rugby Show here on the 42.ie. Ireland have suffered a first defeat in a test since the 2017 Six Nations. So it was a bit of a disappointing morning or evening in Brisbane, depending where you are. We're joined by Murray Kinsella, who's down there now. Murray, how are things?
All good here. Disappointing enough night for Ireland, but another couple of exciting games ahead. Probably warms the series up nicely. Lots to talk through in Ireland's performance, but an unbelievably good test match to get us going.
Yeah, cracking game of rugby, in fairness. Like a lot of sort of titanic clashes, I think, especially early. Like Australia seemed to lay down a marker. There were a couple of like maybe borderline hits, and certainly you could see some of Ireland's key players kind of being targeted with these ferocious hits. But the quality of rugby overall was superb, particularly when, you could say Ireland are probably a little bit tired after the end of the season. Australia are coming together now. So I suppose, like as you mentioned, disappointing results-wise for Ireland, but looking ahead to the next two tests, starting in Melbourne, like were there positives in it for you? Can you see potential for improvement?
Yeah, well, that's certainly the chat from Joe Schmidt and a couple of his players immediately after the game. Joe Schmidt talks about the margins being very skinny in this game. I think that is fair. I don't think Ireland were a huge way off. A couple of crucial moments that potentially could have gone their way. CJ Stander getting just about held up. Joey Carberry missing a penalty even in the first half. So there was those moments where they could have maybe got a little bit of separation or put that kind of pressure on the Wallabies. And they didn't quite manage to get that done today. You mentioned the physicality of the Wallabies. I thought, first of all, that was absolutely outstanding. If you look back to that All Blacks match they won last year here in the same stadium in Suncorp, which Ireland were talking about all week, it was very much the same kind of thing. Outstanding in the collisions, really muscling up. And as you say, making big statement hits on key players for Ireland. Corabetti smashing Murray, Beale smashed Murray as well. Hooper leaving a really strong shoulder in on Joey Carberry at one stage. Carberry did well to get the offload away still, but I thought Australia brought those big physical moments. And against Ireland, if you don't bring that, you're never going to be in a competitive position to win the game, even if your attack is as lethal as Australia's is. They really matched up well there in that department. And I thought Ireland struggled a little bit with that pace of that first half. Peter O'Mahony just mentioned just now that it was one of the fastest first halves he's ever had in his career. So that sums up. And you did see guys who haven't played a lot of rugby recently, the likes of Robbie Henshaw, Bundy Aki, even Ian Henderson. Just early on in the game, it looked like they were a little bit taken aback by the pace of it. So Ireland did manage to get into a decent position, and with 20 to go, Johnny Sexton comes onto the pitch and Ireland are in a 9-8 lead. You think he's going to come on and see this game out, but the Wallabies, in all due credit to them, some brilliant attacking play again. Beale was instrumental, Folau fantastic in the air. And they were definitely deserving of their win. So there's definitely a few key areas for Ireland to improve on ahead of Melbourne. Attack obviously being a key one. CJ Stander got held up that time, but that near try was created by a moment of physical dominance. James Ryan going over Foley and putting Stander through. There wasn't as much creative play despite Ireland having a lot of possession, almost 60% of it. They just lacked that little bit of edge that I think a couple of guys coming back into the team next weekend will bring. So I don't think Ireland were a huge way off, but as you say, they haven't tasted defeat too often. You could see the frustration out there at the end from guys like Murray and Sexton. They'll be hurting after this one, and we can expect a pretty ferocious response, I think.
Yeah, it should be an absolute cracker, the second one. What was Schmidt's mood like? I mean, you mentioned frustration there. I presume that is the sort of overriding theme at the moment.
Yeah, he's not a good loser. He wouldn't be so successful if he was. So he was very downbeat and kind of quiet in the post-match press conference, while pointing out that they weren't too far away. He was frustrated with a couple of decisions from his own players as well. Just little things that he, in his mind, sees as the difference between winning and losing a test match. He won't be talking about, oh my God, my team is completely lacking creativity. He's very much focused on those minor details, and they do make a big difference. I thought Ireland's inability probably to manage the turnover attack from the Wallabies was one of the more concerning aspects. The first try for Foley comes from a turnover where Rob Kearney, who had an uncharacteristically error-prone game, he doesn't come and claim that high ball. He lets it bounce. Pocock grabs it, and they're handling to the left edge when Robbie Henshaw shoots up hard on Foley, and he didn't get that ball, no tackle. They got the ball away, and they go down the left, and and they follow up and score really lethal with a turnover chance. And then again, the same for that one that Flau had disallowed. Bundyaki is just ponderous on the ball. They pile in for the counter ruck, and Beale with that playmaking magic shifts the ball out to Foley, draws in Cronin and Furlong, who were exposed on that outside edge, and Flau goes in. Now that one was disallowed rather harshly, I felt, for that penalty and tackle off the ball, but technically correct penalty. But it just shows how lethal Australia are in those situations, and that, I guess, that is the concern for the rest of the series, because I think Ireland will be able to bring a slightly more physical performance next time around. They'd be hopeful of having Dan Levy back as well. He was missed, I thought, around the breakdown, especially where David Pocock really got on top.
Absolutely, yeah. You alluded to it there, I suppose, a lack of creativity. Like, if you looked at Ireland's midfield, obviously two outstanding players in Aki and Henshaw, but probably glaring was the absence of Gary Ringrose or somebody like that with that kind of game-breaking ability. I suppose beyond the sort of move, it was like a double wrap around. I think it was Keith Earls went down the right wing afterwards. It was around the time when he actually went off for the HIA. He'd picked up the knock beforehand. We probably didn't see Ireland move the ball that much. When we look at, say, Melbourne next weekend, like, do you expect Schmidt to change things up so that we are a little bit more free-flowing in possession?
Yeah, well, I think Johnny Sexton and Gary Ringrose will both be in the back line, and that will make a big difference. Sexton, while he may be seen as a very different player to Carberry, who's got great footwork, some nice passing, which we did see elements of today. He had one loose pass in the first half, but I thought he invited a couple of players onto the ball. But Sexton certainly has that creative edge as well, and we saw it throughout the Six Nations in phase play, even in that passage where they build up to the drop goal in Paris. The couple of creative moments were from Sexton, maybe the crossfield kick or the kick pass, to Keith Earls, and a couple of nice passes where he just challenges the defence. So I think under the kind of intense pressure that the Wallabies managed to bring in defence with their absolute aggression, he's just more experienced at making decisions in the face of that. So he'll add a lot certainly to attack. And Ringrose, let's not forget, in the last two games of Six Nations, added a lot to Ireland's attack. It's a little bit more subtle. It may not be a searing line break, but it's a little bit of footwork to get on the outside or the inside of the defender. You're over the gain line. And then the next guy on the next phase, his decision is much easier because he doesn't have that line speed against him. You know, that Jacob Stockdale try in Twickenham is a great example. Just before that, on the prior phase, Ringrose just used his footwork to get inside a tackler. Suddenly England are numbers down on the narrow side of the next phase, and Murray and Stockdale go and create a bit of magic. So I think him coming in will add to it. And I did think that the midfield was struggling tonight. As we said, they haven't played more so recently in a couple of games, and they just lacked that little bit of creative edge. So I think those two guys will make a difference to the team. It was always likely that there were going to be changes anyway. We expected rotation between the three tests, and it was interesting in the press conference. Schmidt, I asked him about, does this defeat kind of change any plans he had for this trial of new things that he mentioned before the tour, and he said, I've got to push ahead with that because that is a big part of this tour, even though they're obviously down here to win a series as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens potentially, in one of those key halfback positions. Does he give another big start to a less experienced player? We'll probably see Murray and Sexton together just because they're going after that levelling game, because you don't want to be going to Sydney 2-0 down and making a raft of changes. So interesting team selection ahead, but as you mentioned, I do think those two players will add a lot to Ireland's attack.
For sure. And you mentioned there obviously the absence of Dan Levy and maybe somebody, obviously Peter Romani, like you could probably describe him as that sort of groundhog back row, but maybe needed a little bit of help around him today. Probably not Jordy Murphy's finest game. Like, I thought, like, you mentioned like sort of the manic aggression from Australia. There was a moment there in like the 50th minute or so where Australia turned Ireland over in their own 22, cleared with a kick, and then turned Ireland over again, like within the space of 60 seconds. Like, what was it? Was it literally just their individual players in Hooper and Pocock that were particularly dominant, or what was it that gave them the edge there today? And were you a little bit surprised by how dominant they were at the breakdown?
Yeah, well, Ireland are such a brilliant breakdown team. To see them giving up multiple turnovers, 4 or 5 in a game, is always a surprise. Having said that, David Pocock, like, his reputation is built on that, and he's the best jackling player in the world. He's impossible to shift. He just gets that minimal separation after the tackle and clamp back over the ball. He did get pinged once tonight, but he was excellent. It is a collective thing, you think of Pocock in Dublin in November 2016. I remember we did a piece on the 42 about it after the game, and all the attempts that he had at jackling. There were over 20 of them in the game, and Ireland blasted them off. It's always a 2-man, 3-man job. It's not just open side on open side. It's not just Dan Levy being there to clear him out. So Ireland were a little bit off that edge that they usually bring in the breakdown, I felt, across the board. And that'll be a big focus for them this week. There's something massive that can change your game. Like, we're talking about creative edge in attack, but if you're turning the ball over, there goes a couple more chances. Even though things like knock-ons at the base of the ruck, a couple of them tonight, again, you're releasing that pressure valve that Ireland are usually so good at keeping on. So, breakdown will be a big focus for them. That example there almost led to a Wallabies try, the one where Pete Samu just off the bench makes a big statement, a big impact. And that kind of did sum up the breakdown story for Ireland. So that's among the key kind of lessons for them in this game, and I do think it'll be better next weekend.
For sure. Like one of the, I suppose, like Marius van der Westhuizen, we would have had not necessarily history with him. He became embroiled in a controversy during the Six Nations. Yeah. But what did you make of his performance? Like, it seemed as though, in fairness to him, given this sort of frenetic nature of the game, he allowed the breakdown to sort of run fairly smoothly, and it was an open, enjoyable game, as we mentioned. The last 20 minutes, actually, as a commenter here, W. Dunn Pete, points out, well, he says the referee was a disgrace. Last 20 minutes couldn't do enough to give the Aussies a winning advantage. It did sort of seem to get away from him a little bit. A couple of dodgy calls here and there.
Yeah. I think if we're nitpicking, and this always tends to happen after Ireland lose, you could definitely have a go at a couple of those decisions. And certainly the likes of Sexton were I guess, angered by a couple of decisions. Schmidt mentioned a few of them afterwards. I really don't think that is the reason Ireland lost, though, and I think the focus on that would be getting away from the real point here. I thought before that last 20 minutes, I thought Van der Westhuizen was really good. There was one kind of harsh penalty against Hooper for not rolling out of ruck. I didn't think there was any Irish support player there to actually enter the ruck, so they probably felt harshly done by in that regard. And I'm sure they'll pick out lots of stuff for their report. Yes, Joe Schmidt's referee report will always be interesting after a game, but I don't think it was the reason Ireland lost. I thought the Wallabies were the best team, and they would have won anyway, even without a couple of those questionable decisions.
Michael Cheika was obviously, fairly impressed by his side's performance, I presume. What kind of things was he saying afterwards? And I suppose, if we can expect Ireland to make changes for Melbourne, do you see Australia switching anything up?
Yeah, Cheika, really proud of his team. Spoke a lot about how their work ethic had been just as good as Ireland's, almost better. They targeted that as a big thing. Ireland do tend to outwork teams, and that physicality we've already mentioned as well. He knew that if they could bring those two elements with the turnover attack and those attacking threats, we've also spoken about that they could get this win. So he's really happy with it. In terms of changes, potentially one in the back row. I think Ned Hannigan is fit again, so he's a line-out option in the back row, as well as being a pretty hard grafter as well. So I think that might be one, but to be honest, I think they'll be looking for the continuity, and they'll be looking to build on that performance and create even more of those chances that they did tonight.
And if you were to look at Ireland's team, obviously you mentioned you'd expect Sexton to come back in, you'd expect Ringrose to start. Do you see Schmidt making any other changes that might be less glaringly obvious?
Yeah, I can imagine that it will go towards more of that Grand Slam team, a full frontline 15, Furlong and those guys back into the front row to start. Sean Cronin finally getting a start. He would have imagined it probably would have come in the first test with Roy Best missing. I do think there is still room, and I do think his comments saying that I've got to also remember that this tour is about trialing a couple of new things. I thought that was interesting. So I think, I'm not sure quite what it is. Potentially a scrum half change, or maybe Ty Byrne getting an involvement and getting a cap, and maybe even a couple of guys like Cooney and Ross Byrne coming off the bench potentially. So he does have to get that balance right, but I think it will be pretty much close to what we would say would be a frontline Irish 15.
And overall, before we let you go, you'd be reasonably confident going into Melbourne despite this morning's defeat, particularly with some of those names coming in, and maybe Schmidt pointing more towards that Grand Slam winning team. That you're confident that we can level it up next weekend?
Yeah, I'd be confident, and I really do hope it goes into that final game. What a series it would be. But I think there are clearly identifiable areas that we've spoken about for Ireland. Get that breakdown aggression, get those barrels and those first guys into the ruck, getting rid of that jackal player. Sexton and Ringrose adding a little bit to the attack, and and Ireland just being a little bit more patient with that and building more pressure on Australia like they had done in the Six Nations, shoring up their ability to transition from attack into defence and just being a bit more aware about that threat that the Wallabies bring. So I think there are clear areas for them to focus on. I think it's almost like a weight off their shoulders. They're not on this amazing winning streak anymore. Now they've got to respond. Now they've got to react, and that's a pretty good position for a team to deliver a highly motivated performance. So yeah, I'd expect a lot better from Ireland, and I would expect it to go down to the last game in Sydney.
Well, that sounds good to me. Bert Murray, we'll let you go before you get locked into Suncorp. A pleasure as always, and we'll chat to you soon. Enjoy your week. Cheers, Gav. And folks at home, thanks a million for tuning in. That's all we've got time for today. We'll be back again on Thursday with squad announcements and things like that. So do tune in then. And then we'll be back again on Saturday. But you guys as well, enjoy your week. And until next time, take it easy.